provocative, they're incendiary. They're the people that, in fact, alive. I mean, it's the Sunni governments, the Al Khalifa and the Al Saud and the others who keep alive the Islamic Revolution. It's not the Shia communities that continue to maintain their grip on Khomeini as a symbolic figure. It's people like the Prime Minister in Bahrain who antagonizes by playing the sectarian card, which is insightful. And I think angers, justifiably so, the Shia community, who then pursues a more provocative, antagonistic kind of politics. So a shift in the kind of power in the political system in Bahrain, as an example, that would allow the Shia to sort of play a more representative role in politics, would be more stabilizing, in the sense that that would serve American interests.
But only in the long term, not in the short term.
Well, I think that it's uncertain whether in the short term it would actually be a problem. The Fifth Fleet, I don't think most Bahraini Shia or otherwise care whether the Fifth Fleet's there in Bahrain at this point. There's a moment of opportunity. I mean, I'll relate an anecdote. When I was in Bahrain in 2004 or 2005 doing research for the ICG report on Bahrain, I sat down with Bahraini Hezbollah and asked them a series of questions about why they were doing what they were doing and what was their political line and what was it they were trying to achieve. And they had a number of answers that weren't particularly satisfying. But the thing I ended on was, what can the U.S. do to serve sort of the issue of reform and the Shia community's interests? And they didn't have a good answer for that either. But I was interviewing this group of about 15 young guys in the village of Sitra, and they had just staged a massive rally in Sitra. About 80,000 people turned out. And the Shia community's big claim to sort of political, they were trying to gain favor from the state and demonstrate their allegiance to Bahrain as a nation. So they carried the Bahraini national flag. And they toted this around and thought that this was a better symbol than carrying around Hezbollah's flag. At the end of the conversation, I asked them about how the U.S. could serve their interests, and they said, well, if you think it's appropriate, next week we'll have another demonstration and we'll carry the American flag. And I sort of, I encouraged them not to do that, but it was, I think the Shia, there was a moment in 2003, 2004, and even early 2005 where the Shia saw the U.S. as perhaps a supporter in the region. Iraq was read in many ways that way. I mean, there are other anecdotes in Saudi Arabia that go in a similar way. Are they going to be, in Bahrain in particular, they're going to be destabilizing 70% of the population? Are they then going to treat the Sunnis like they've been treated historically?
Sure.
That's a harder question to answer. Now, Nakash raises another issue sort of regionally, and he says Shiism is a force for political progressive thought in the region, that they are the democratizers. And that's a more complicated question to come to terms with. I mean, the answer is yes, they do promote reform because they're out of power. So they want an equal share, so they justify that political line that way. But they're also retrograde in other instances. I mean, the Bahraini Shia they look to Iran and the most conservative elements in Iraq when it comes to women's rights, for example. They're not particularly progressive. In fact, they're not progressive at all. So are American interests served by seeing women, sort of subordinated once again in a place where they enjoy rights?
But is there, that was one of my questions for later, but since you've raised it, we'll talk about their attitudes toward women. Are they more retrograde than the existing order?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, that is good news.
No, it's, and the battle right now that's taking place in Bahrain is over the personal status law, family law, which governs rules in sort of divorce, inheritance, child custody, and the Bahraini, the Shia community, led by a particular number of clerics, has waged a fierce opposition to the Sunni government's attempt to codify Islamic law, family law, and basically guarantee the rights of women when they come before the courts. And the Shia have been the most forceful one.
Just to give you an idea, there's political society, since they don't have parties, political society El Wefaq, which is largely an expression of Shia politics in the region, is fighting the good fight in that they want to reopen the Constitution to give the Council of Deputies more power. But that seems like this is a democratically oriented group. This is great stuff. This is good for the United States. But at the same time, their position on women is outrageous. In fact, one of the leaders of Al Wefaq wanted to pass a law such that windows in Bahraini apartment buildings, women, you could not see out.
Right.
And there's been a recent proposal that opening the political system more to women, and they have fought this tooth and nail.
But this is a little surprising to me because in Iran, the role of women politically and otherwise is in fact much more progressive from our perspective than it is in the more radical Sunni societies. What's the story?
Well, I mean, Toby and Steve say that the emerging Shiite clerical class has perceptions that are bad for women's rights. I can't believe they're worse than the Saudi clerical community.
Well, that's the question.
I mean, I think that's the benchmark. I mean, they can strive to get to that level, but it requires a great degree of resourcefulness and ingenuity and power to get to that level of gender disenfranchisement. In case of Iran, I think it's just sort of you see the legacy of the Iranian Revolution that was fought by men, women, Marxists, liberals, conservatives.
So unrelated to Shiism specifically.
The way the coalition that brought the revolution to power was not entirely disenfranchised after the revolution. I mean, there are more women in universities in Iran than there are men. However, that doesn't necessarily reflect in the labor market. Then the numbers drop to about 20%. So there's still exclusionary policies. Entire government posts and so on, women can't serve in. But they do have a visible public role. For a while, there were more women in the Iranian legislature than there were in the House of Representatives. Now, people don't say that those women are extremely conservative.
Right.
I mean, not every woman is a sort of an advocate of a liberal policy and so forth. But there's a greater degree of integration in the public society.
Ray, I'm going to ask you to answer the question of whether, if in a variety of countries like Lebanon, Bahrain, Kuwait, others, if there is increased sense of Shiite empowerment, whether that serves American interests.
I mean, the curious thing about this is, and this is perhaps a reflection of the war with Iraq, there is an identification with Shi'i parties, even among secular Shiites, in a sense that they feel, despite the fact that they might not be practicing, that their interests are better represented and safeguarded by parties who are sort of self-consciously Shi'i in terms of their political composition. That's an interesting part in the sense that you can be secular but nevertheless have one aspect of your identity dictate your political perceptions. That question comes, what are the American interests in the Gulf?
Right. How to define them?
I mean, how do you define the American interests in the Gulf? If number of things happen, if Iran remains a cantankerous but largely self-satisfied power, certainly not one inclined to become a revisionist state. If Iraq remains a unitary state with considerable degree of internal disorder and even some degree of violence, but nevertheless is sort of crossed along, then I actually don't know what the Fifth Fleet that Stephen worries so much about is doing in the Gulf. I mean, American soldiers are designed to do something very specific, prevent one country potentially from invading another country, guarding the territorial demarcations. If those territorial demarcations are not under threat, then what exactly is the Fifth Fleet doing there? I'm not suggesting American disengagement from the Gulf. American missionaries, American educators, American writers, American businessmen, American commercial interests. But we tend to equate American presence with the American military presence. And at some point you have to figure out what is the role of the military and is it a suitable role for what is happening in the Gulf. If Gulf is increasingly, in terms of its tensions, self-regulating, then is there a necessity for this sort of a robust and ultimately politically incendiary continued American presence in the region?
Steve, let me ask the same question a slightly different way to you. I think Condi Rice said, and I think President Bush have said at some point in the last couple of years that for 60 years American policy was to focus on stability in the region, and look what that got us, 9/11. And so we've got a new policy. We're interested in individual rights and democracy in these societies, and that's going to ultimately serve them and serve us in ways that we had failed in the past. So I guess what I'd like you to talk about is whether you think that the rise of Shiism fits into that pattern, and also whether you think that they are right to say that that has failed and this is the way to go forward. All in a few minutes, please.
Sure, of course. The last part of Secretary Rice's phrase was that this focus on stability has actually brought instability in the region, and I would take issue with that. In fact, the region is ultra stable in many ways, and that's the problem that we've run into. And American policy has sought to not make it unstable, but kind of inject some dynamism into the political process there. Now, if it is in the United States' interest to promote democracy, individual rights, and all those kinds of things that the Secretary of State and the President have been talking about over the course of the last 3.5 years, well, then certainly Shia political rights being extended to the Shia in places like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and certainly Iraq are quite good things. The problem that we run into is that we still need to work with the Khalifa in Bahrain and the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. And what concerns me, I'm not so concerned about the status of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, but what I'm concerned about is the reaction that these regimes with whom we still need to work will be to the rise of Shia power and their perception of threat, and what then will be incumbent upon us to respond. Because after all, there still is a war in Iraq. There still is concern about Iranian nuclear proliferation. So I think for at least the time being, there is a rationale for the presence of the U.S. Fifth Fleet to be there, and a rationale for a large military presence in Qatar. So we do still need to work with these, and of course the whole question of counterterrorism as well. So I think that in the kind of broad abstract sense about promoting democracy and human rights and political rights, it can't be a bad thing. But the effect that that has then on Arab elites is where the concern is for me.
Well, I guess we don't. The trouble is we don't know the end of the story. But if we look at Iraq, there are many who would argue that it has not been a great thing, right? That actually the helping the Shia in Iraq has not at the moment improved the condition of life in Iraq or improved our interests in the region, but far away from the end of the story. But the problem is, and maybe Toby, you could talk about this for a minute now. Let's take how the Saudis, or how generally Sunnis view what has happened. Do they see American efforts in the region as really some effort to kind of ruin their own interests and hand things over to the Shia, and therefore they resist, and therefore violence arises, and therefore our interests in the end are not served?
Well, I've argued before that, in fact, the Iraq War complicated both American interests in the Gulf, for obvious reasons, but also Shia interests in the Gulf. To look very closely at sort of the trajectory of Shia, the Shia emergence, if we want to call it that, in Saudi Arabia, it predates the Iraq War. The Shia have been politically active in Saudi Arabia since the late 70s. They were confrontational. In the early 90s, they became accommodationist and essentially reached a political compromise with the ruling Al Saud that went nowhere. There was no pressure on the government of Saudi Arabia to deal with this community effectively. 9/11 changed a lot of things in Saudi Arabia, and the thing it gave sort of the most hope for was this nascent reform movement that emerged shortly afterward, within a couple of years, and a large component of that was a group of Shia activists who had been active in previous decades, but took part seriously in this sort of national, liberal, Islamic, whatever, there's lots of other labels, to sort of promote political reform in the kingdom. The Iraq War set back their efforts. In a lot of ways, the reform movement suffered a setback because American pressure, which was leveraged on the kingdom, was distracted elsewhere, or diverted elsewhere. But also for the Shia community, the restructuring of the balance of power in Iraq has had deleterious effects for Shia interests in Saudi Arabia, for precisely the reasons that your question sort of raised. And those have to do with the perception amongst not only the House of Saud, but also their clerical backers in Saudi Arabia, about what's taking place north of the border. And the perception is that Iraqi Shia have aligned with American imperial interests to occupy sort of this Arab state, and that has set back the region's interests in terms of its Islamic orientation, but also its political cohesiveness. So the U.S. is seen as a destabilizing force, and the Shia are seen as having latched on to this for their own opportunistic ends. And in Saudi Arabia, that's had real tough consequences for the Shia community. They're still able to participate in local politics, but they don't have the same kind of national presence that they had previously. So in as much as Iraq has altered the balance regionally, it's also set back the specific nationalist goals of Shia communities, not only in Saudi Arabia, but also Bahrain.
Ray, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think there are two things that happen when people discuss Shiism, and they tend to equate sort of political expressions of Shiism with radicalism, which is no longer the case because, as